So I noticed a bunch of different, when it says the
All right.
there's
What's going on, everybody? Thank you for tuning into today's Heavy.com live stream on Facebook. I'm Devin Clements, a contributor to Heavy.com's coverage of the Kansas City Chiefs. And today in this live stream, I'm joined by former NFL general manager and executive of the year, and now Heavy.com's front office insider, Randy Mueller. Randy's going to be joining us today to talk about the Chiefs. Randy, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure, Devin. It's good to be with you. Always look forward to talking a little AFC West. I spent 27 of my 35 years in the AFC West, so I'm always up for talking about that.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't wait to hear what you have to say about everything that's gone on this offseason with the Chiefs, what's happened, what's going to happen. A lot has happened so far, Randy. I'm sure we can agree on that. A lot of questions going into the offseason with the Chiefs in regards to who they're going to keep, who they're going to bring in, how they're going to manage their salary cap situation, because it was pretty sketchy going into the offseason. So to brush over it quickly, they let Tyrann Mathieu walk. They restructured Frank Clark. They bring in some guys, Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdez-Scantling. They bring in Justin Reed. Oh, and did I mention that they traded Tyreek Hill as well? You know? So a lot has gone on so far, Randy. So based on what you've seen from them this offseason, with a couple weeks to go before the draft begins, how would you grade Brett Veach and the Chiefs front office?
Well, I think it's always, for the fans, it's always about who we've added, right? Who we've added. I don't think it's always about that in this time window. I think it's about making sound decisions. And I think the Chiefs showed restraint. They made some resource allocations decisions by trading Tyrique. They said rather than having $30 million on a non-quarterback, we want that money to use to build our team out in a different way. And I think the results of that will take a while for people to see. Anytime you still have Andy Reid and Brett Veach in charge, I think you've got to feel like you're going to have a good group. But I would remind Chief fans, we don't play a game this week or next. It really doesn't count until Labor Day. But I think the other thing they've done is they've allowed vital parts of the past, like Honey Badger, to leave, really. I mean, that's the hardest thing about being a GM, is to allow players that have really helped you in the past, allow them to walk out the door. That's really hard. So I think that's been done good. I love the Justin Reed signing. I was one of the guys who studied him a lot with the Chargers the year he came out. And I'll be honest, I had a first-round grade on him. I think he's a really good player. So I think that for the price, especially when you're talking about the safety market kind of settling in at 10, 10 and a half, maybe even 11 now, you get him for that number, younger, whether it's 3 or 4 years, 5 years, I think he has a chance to be around there a long time. And that was the downside of Tyrique Matthews, is that he's a little older, doesn't really play a position per se. I think Justin Reed is a true free safety, which helps him. And I think they're going to still find some ways to add to the mix with some veterans before long. So to circle back around to your initial question, I would grade them a solid B for where they're at right now. And again, I understand letting go Tyreek Hill is hard, but it's what they do with these picks and what they do to fill in from here going out. That'll determine the balance of the grade. But I think it's a solid B.
Yeah. And since we're on the topic here, let's just talk about the elephant in the room, the Tyreek Hill trade, right? I think it took a lot of people off guard when it initially happened, just because there was some rumblings about the Chiefs and Tyreek Hill trying to work out a contract extension, pay him as one of those top guys in the NFL. And then all of a sudden it comes out, they're shopping him around, and then a couple hours later, he's traded to the Miami Dolphins, right? So it kind of came out of nowhere in terms of where everyone thought it was going.
Right.
So, Randy, you kind of gave us an idea of how you felt and what the Chiefs benefit from in terms of this Tyreek Hill trade. But when it initially happened, thinking like you do as a former NFL general manager and a front office guy, what were your initial thoughts when you saw that Tyreek Hill was traded and for 5 draft picks to the Miami Dolphins?
Yeah. Well, I was surprised like everybody else. I didn't know that the salary negotiations had escalated to the point where they had gotten. So I was surprised. Anytime you evaluate players and speed is your common thread throughout the league, letting something like that go, letting a skill set like that go is surprising. But when you sit back and analyze it, like we talked about a little bit, I mean, you could make the case that Tyreek was a little risky off the field. His rare commodity of speed really isn't something that a lot of teams covet as much. And I think in Andy's case, by signing Juju, by signing Marquez, Valdez, Scantling, they kind of think that they can scheme to make up for the one guy, and that they've got numbers now in their favor. And I'll say this, I don't know if this had anything to do with it, Devin, but in 2019, Tyrique missed 4 games. And I believe, don't hold me to the exact number, but I think Pat Mahomes threw for an average of 283, 284 yards during those 4 games. So they've proved that they can exist without Tyrique. I mean, obviously everybody sees the explosive plays, but they proved they have a system in place that if it's, you're always going to have Andy Reid, you're always going to have Mahomes. If it includes a game plan that's fresh every week, they think they can move the ball on people. So I was surprised, but when you hear where the numbers had gotten contract-wise, and then what was offered in return, not surprised in the end that they did pull the trigger.
Yeah, Randy, I'm really glad you brought up those 4 games from back in 2019, because a lot of fans that I've seen that get upset about the trade try to overlook that or maybe not even remember that happening. And at the end of the day, Patrick Mahomes is an elite quarterback in the NFL, and he's proven, albeit with a small sample size without Tyreek Hill on the field, he can do it at a high level.
Right.
So based on the Chiefs' assignment this offseason at wide receiver, they may be kind of shifting the way they do things on offense.
Yeah.
Defenses are certainly going to have to change the way they defend the Chiefs' offense because Tyreek Hill's no longer there. So we'll have to see if that benefits the Chiefs or if they're going to have some growing pains this upcoming season because of what's happened this offseason.
Right. I would just add this, Devin, one other thing with regard to that. In people should remember this. The Tyreek numbers, when you pay somebody $30 million like that, a non-quarterback, which doesn't happen very often in the league, let's say the cap number does come in this year at 15, 16 million, something like that. Well, I'm no math major, but that means the end of the deal, it's going to be 45 or 50 million in cap count against a team when their salary caps, maybe at that point it's 250, but still, that's a pretty big chunk to pay to one guy who's a non-quarterback. So the numbers look like, oh, the Chiefs, they could have afforded him these first couple of years, but it's the final years of the deal that end up coming back to bite you. So I think in all, it's probably a good trade for both teams. So I would definitely give the Chiefs a thumbs up.
Awesome. Okay. And I just want to talk about this now since we're on the subject about pushing, the void years, the dummy years, pushing contracts back so they can free up cap space now and worry about it later, Randy. You're going to know way more about this than I do, or maybe a lot of people that are watching this. So it's great that we have you here because this is something that's been bothering me for the last few months, just seeing these contracts and how they work.
Right.
Now, when it comes to the way these general managers and these front offices are structuring these players' contracts, as we've seen, these cap numbers are very low for the first year, maybe even the second year. Then they're adding on 4 or 5 years onto these contracts. So that way in the 4th or 5th years, that's where the cap space is. And then it might even void out. So that way the player's not even actually on the team by that point in time anyway. So is this like a loophole that's going on right now in terms of contracts in the NFL? And is it something you think the NFL is going to try to address moving forward? And is it something that teams are going to have to actually worry about, 3 years from now, maybe 4 years from now? Or is it something that coming up next offseason, whether it's 2 years from now or 3 years from now, they're just going to extend these guys or restructure their contracts again to lower the cap number and just continue doing that forward? What's going on here with this?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's become relevant really because of the reduction in cap last year because of the pandemic. Remember, the cap went down a big chunk last year and everybody was scrambling to get in under the cap. So what they did was they wrote fictitious years that void out. Voidable years have always been there. They're a tool. They're a way to push off cap dollars, but eventually you still have to pay the cap charge. It's just the equivalent of you or I using our credit card to buy everything. And we say, well, we can, we'll pay it off later. We'll pay it off later. There's no getting out of it. You don't get to write that debt off. They end up having to pay it. And like you said, when these years void off and the player's not there, then that, for everybody's lack of a better word, that becomes dead money on your cap without anything to show for it. So it's not really a loophole. It's always been a choice that teams can make. I don't think the league or ownership have ever used it as much, but we've never had the pandemic that forced people to use it. So the last 12 months, people have reduced cap. That's all they've done, all based on our lack of revenues in 2020 during that season. So I guess we can blame COVID in a way for making it more acceptable to write voids in contracts for cap relief. But teams are still in recovery mode because of this, I think. After this year, I think more normal approaches, are going to be prevalent league wide. I think there'll be less voids after this year. You'll always have teams whose philosophy is to kick the can, kick the can. Eventually, someone has to pay the price, though. So just remember that. And whether that comes in a reduction of roster, a reduction of really good players, at some point, you're going to have to pay the piper. So I think even though it's been done more often now than we've ever, thought of it being used for, eventually some teams will come back to realizing that the truth is probably somewhere in between. You want to use it to some extent so you can stretch the cap to add players, but you can't use it to the extent that we've seen teams the last 12 months.
Got it. Well, that definitely helps clarify that situation for me, so I appreciate that intel. So let's circle back to the Tyrique Hill situation. And like we discussed, it was a blockbuster trade. They got 5 draft picks. They have 12 this year because of that. It's a lot of draft picks to be working with if you're in the Kansas City Chiefs position. But based on what they've done in terms of adding players, re-signing players, letting players walk this offseason, then you get that trade. Do you think the Chiefs are done adding in free agency given what they have for cap space and what their roster looks like at the moment?
Well, a couple things. I think by trading Tyrique, the bottom line is that Andy and Brett Veach kind of can control their own roster build out now. If they were to pay him that kind of money, they would have to do without in a lot of other areas. So I do think they have some cap flexibility now. Having said that, I think they'll probably only sign value players from here on out. Now, their focus is going to be on the draft the next 2 or 3 weeks, without a doubt. But when that draft ends and they still can kind of initiate that, hey, we have some weaknesses still, we have some depth chart holes to fill, then I could see them going out and adding another veteran or two, but only at a reasonable cost. I don't think they're ever going to go out, at least this offseason, and spend a bunch of money on one guy. That would be defeating the purpose. If they were going to do that, they'd probably been better off keeping Tyrique. But I think you're going to see their impact players this year and next year come from the draft. That's just the way it is. That's the benefit you gain by getting rid of Tyrique, is you have some draft choice capital now that you can kind of maneuver and make your team better. I think but I will say this, after the draft, they'll still have a need or two. All of us are the same. Every GM never is really happy with his roster. But I think they will look for value signings. And that means an ascending younger player or a veteran who's come off a deal somewhere else looking to make a 1-year splash to get back to the free agent market. Those deals in May and June are really prevalent. I go back to last year when the Packers signed Devontae, the linebacker. Help me out. He came from
Campbell.
Yes, Campbell. They signed him in June, I believe. And it was a relatively cheap signing. And I said at the time, this is a crazy good signing. How come nobody has brought this guy on yet? But those are the kind of moves that I think the Chiefs will make in May or in June when they realize after minicamp, hey, we still have a need for something else. Let's shore it up. And what I call it will be a value signing, in that they might give a guy a 1-year deal to kind of reprove himself in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. The one player that comes to mind in that particular situation is Melvin Ingram. Last offseason in July, he signed with the Steelers. Obviously, that didn't work out. They traded him to the Chiefs. He was fantastic with the Chiefs once he got to them at the end of October. And I think that's a guy that if the Chiefs were to wait off in the draft, not get what they want in the draft, and then want to sign one of those veteran guys to a 1-year deal to run it back again, I think Melvin Ingram's a guy that will be welcomed back. Brett Veach made it known at the NFL Scouting Combine that you would absolutely consider having him back for the right price. So that's a guy for me that would be a no-brainer for them.
I was going to say, sometimes you don't even know that this is going to be the critical guy. You may sign a guy or two to the veteran minimum in May or June, and it might be a favor, Devin. It might be a favor to the agent. It might be some other backdoor deal, but that guy happens more times than not, ends up being a vital cog for you come November. So just the fact that you end up staying in the market and staying attached to an agent or a player might end up helping your roster in the long run just by picking him up in June.
Yeah, absolutely. And just some other guys, just a note out there that are going to be veterans that could be available still during the summertime. Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham Jr. once he starts rehabbing back from his ACL. And then Tyrann Mathieu. If something doesn't happen with him and maybe all of a sudden he wants to come back and play for the Chiefs, I'm never going to say never, even though it's not likely.
Right.
But
there's always a price.
Exactly. Just to give an example of kind of some of the higher profile guys that could be available come the summertime, which isn't always the case. Maybe there's 1 or 2, but not that many. Right. And that's just a few of them off the top of my head. But let's go back to talking about the Chiefs roster specifically, Randy, here. And obviously we know we got the draft here in a couple weeks. They're going to be adding plenty of talent that way to shape out the roster more. But based on what you see from the Chiefs roster at the moment and what they have offensively and defensively on special teams, and just the kind of coaching staff changes that have happened this offseason as well, with Matt Nagy coming on as this offensive assistant quarterbacks coach. Do you think the Chiefs at the moment have what they need to succeed on the offensive side of the football and on the defensive side of the football?
I would say this. I'm more confident with their offense because of Andy, because of Pat Mahomes, the things we've talked about. Their offensive line has some really good young tools. I think that group will always keep them in games. And I think Andy will eventually, I mean, he's always been a guy who wants to throw first, but he'll realize he has to take some pressure off Mahomes by running the ball. But my question marks would probably come on defense. I think what has let them down the last couple of years, in my opinion, is that the secondary players and their skill set haven't really fit the schemes that Steve Spagnuolo has wanted to run. When they won the Super Bowl that year, they were playing a different style of defense, a little different coverages, and their players matched it. So I still think they have some work to do on defense, and I think that will probably be where they, go come draft day. At least the first couple picks, I could sure see them spending them on defense, and I don't really mean safety. I'm talking about either an outside rusher that kind of makes Frank Clark's inconsistencies, either pick up or go away, or a corner that plays the kind of scheme and technique that Spagnuolo wants to play. So I think they've got to do a really good job of matching player skill sets with the schemes that they want to play on defense. And if they do that, they'll get better on defense. But I'm always going to feel okay about the offense just because, like I said, of who's involved with pulling the trigger. But I think defensively they can help themselves. And it happens to be a good draft for defensive players.
Yeah, I think last season was a kind of a scary experience for anyone watching the Chiefs defense. It took almost half the year for them to finally start playing at a high level. And then that lasted for a month, maybe 2 months. And then come the end of the regular season and in the playoffs, that defense wasn't what it was come the middle of the season. So there was a lot of inconsistencies there, a lot of odd play from their really good players. I mean, Tyrann Mathieu, Chris Jones, Frank Clark, Anthony Hitchens. These guys are guys that were at least consistent in 2020. But in 2021, they weren't looking like themselves. And I think that whole scheme change was exactly what you said it was. It kind of disrupted everything there because the talent level they had on the defense did not resemble what we were seeing on the field.
Right. I think sometimes it's as easy as matching those skill sets with the schemes. And I think they're aware of that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So now we're talking about the draft here and some guys that they could potentially add in at certain positions. So, Randy, obviously you've been through a draft or two in your time in the NFL, right? And depending on where you're drafting on day one especially, it can significantly impact who you're going to get or what you could potentially do in terms of moving around the draft board. So based on the fact that the Chiefs now have 2 first-round picks back-to-back, 29 and 30 in the first round, courtesy of the Tyrique Hill trade, and what they need on their roster to fill out the rest of their roster to go into the 2022 season, based on what you're hearing, what you're reading about prospects, what you're doing for your own research on prospects, what do you believe could happen in terms of players moving up and down draft boards on actual draft day among the other 31 NFL teams that could potentially work in Kansas City's favor?
Right. Well, it's really hard to forecast that far down. When you pick 29 or 30, about the only thing you can do is, I think, and history shows this to be true, I think they'll get a player or two that is stacked on their board in their top 18, maybe 20. Nobody stacks their board the same. Nobody sequences players exactly the same. So everybody will be a little different. And I've always said, hey, if we're picking 20th, we're going to get somebody in our top 15. They're just going to fall out of there. I think what the Chiefs have to be ready to do, and what will cause them some consternation, is to take the best player that falls in their lap, as opposed to taking a lesser player at a position of need. That's the caveat, right? Especially when you pick toward the end of the first round, is that I've always said it makes no sense for us to pass up players that we valued all year higher than a guy that we're going to take a level or two down just to fill a need. It doesn't make sense to me. But there are teams that do that. They believe in starting out and filling needs right from the get-go. And so I think you got to be a little careful with that. I mean, Andy's been around. He knows. Brett's been around. They kind of know how it works. But I know this. Ozzie Newsome, and I always look back at their history in Baltimore when he was there, and even in Cleveland. He made a great history year after year of picking a player when he was picking 30th every year that fell out of a tree and just landed in his lap and didn't overthink it. Whether it was Ed Reed, whether it was Terrell Suggs, whether it was Upshaw, the defensive end from Alabama. These guys were all really good pro players, and they fell into his lap, and he was picking in the bottom 3 or 4 picks every year. So I think the Chiefs have to kind of look at that as a template for how to fill, picks 29 and 30. I don't think it helps them this year to have this be a draft where there might only be one quarterback picked. I mean, there might be a couple, but in my mind, that's a reach. And so they would love to have a draft where 4 or 5 quarterbacks got picked, because that pushes everybody down 4 or 5 slots to them. It's not going to be the case. There may be 2 or 3 receivers picked. The 4th and 5th receiver that I hear a lot of people talking about, Williams from Atlanta and London from USC, are both medical issues. So they're going to be hard to draft in the first round above where they are. So they may have to settle if they do decide they need to get some of that speed back that Tyrique vacated. A guy like Jameson Williams from Alabama, but he won't play the first half of the year. He blew out his ACL the last game of the year. So to think he's going to be ready before October is crazy. So, but that might be the kind of pick that has impact long-term that they settle on if all else fails and the defensive player they want isn't there. So they have a couple different ways to go. I think fans would obviously like to see that skill set of speed replaced, but you're not going to get that with London, who has a fractured ankle and still hasn't worked out, canceled the workout this week because of it as well. So you're going to have some issues maybe with some medical guys. But when you pick down in the first part of the draft, you can maybe afford to take a flyer on something like that. If, like I said, if a defensive player who's in your top 15 or 18 doesn't fall to you. I don't know if that makes any sense, Devin, but that's just kind of strategically how GMs look at it.
No, it does absolutely make sense. And like you mentioned before, with the quarterback class the way it is this year, not very strong, right? We got a lot of edge rushers, a lot of linemen, a lot of wide receivers that are going to go in that first round, right? But the quarterbacks, and this is where I think it could potentially maybe surprise everyone and work in Kansas City's favor. If all of a sudden 2 or 3 of those quarterbacks start going in that first rounds, and then one of those defensive players starts falling to the Chiefs at that 29th pick, it could benefit them for sure. But we also can't forget the fact that a quarter of the NFL teams this year don't have a first-round pick. So maybe they take one of those 2 and then trade out of the first round and accumulate even more draft capital going forward, right?
It'll depend on how they see the draft as far as quality goes and through how many picks that quality lasts before it falls off. All first-round picks are not equal, and everybody evaluates differently as well. So, the proof will be in the pudding when we sit here 2 years from now and analyze it. But it depends how many quality players they have. Let's just say they view it as a 10 or 12 player top quality draft. They might try to figure out how to package those picks together with something else to get up there and get one of those guys. If he were to start falling at 14, 15, 16, and he's the 6th guy on their board, which traditionally happens. That's how different teams evaluate and how different they see players. So that may bring on a whole nother set of events where trading up makes some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at the end of the day, if they don't have a player on the board that they think they can draft there and make, have a good reason for, and is not reaching for them, and they end up taking someone in the later rounds because of it that they think they might want to develop in a year or 2, then they can go in after the draft. And like we said, maybe they could bring in someone like a Jarvis Landry or an Odell Beckham Jr. to kind of be a placeholder for the 2022 season. And hopefully these guys that they drafted later in the rounds can develop and turn it into something that can be a long-term answer for them, right?
Well, if I was a receiver, I would surely walk myself to Kansas City to get on that roster to play with Pat Mahomes. So they have that going for them at the end of each day.
Absolutely. That makes 2 of us. All right, Randy. Well, that's all the questions I have for you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the Chiefs, what's happened this offseason, what could potentially happen moving forward. And let's hope for the best for Chiefs Kingdom, because I think there's a lot of doubters out there right now that think because of the Tyrique Hill trade and because of how cap-strapped the team was going into the offseason that the Chiefs were kind of regressed, especially with something we didn't even get into really about Russell Wilson coming to Denver, Josh McDaniels and Devontae Adams and Chandler Jones joined the Raiders, and then all these guys, J.C. Jackson and
definitely Wild West,
right?
Yeah,
adding superpowers around the Chiefs doing more low-key things just to try to kind of stack up around Patrick Mahomes and the rest of that roster. But I think they've done a good job given their situation this offseason, and I'm sure you would agree with me based on what you've said over the last 25 minutes. So hoping for the best with Chiefs Kingdom. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Randy, and thank you for everyone that tuned into this live stream today.
Thanks, guys.